to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
That's right, Aaron. We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron, you're up this week.
See.
What are you bringing to the table today?
I am bringing our September book, Theory of Water, Nishnaabe Maps to the Times Ahead by Leanne Betasamosake Simpson to the table. So this book was published by Haymarket Books in April this year, 2025. It's beautiful.
Yes.
It's a beautiful book that shares Nishnaabe wisdom and teachings about water and how those teachings could transform our collective relationships to the world beyond the white supremacist, capitalist, imperialist, patriarchal settler colony.
Yes.
And Leanne shares personal stories, experiences alongside teachings, and also considers how these teachings fit within abolitionism, Black radicalism, feminism, and more. And there's a bunch of concepts in here that I think will stick with me for a while, similar to how emergent strategies have stuck with me. And I feel like I can connect to those at all kinds of moments, just out of the blue, where something happens. I'm like, oh, yeah, emergent strategy. Mm-hmm. But Leanne explains a little bit more about the theory of water at the start of the second chapter, which is called Nebe, the Nishnaabe word for water. She says, quote, "It was in the final chapter of my book, Rehearsals for Living, as I was writing the last letter to my co-author, Robin Maynard, that I began to think about water, Nebe, as a theory, or a mapping of life and affiliation and global connection. In other words, as a form of indigenous internationalism. I became interested in thinking alongside water as it traveled the globe over and over, moving inside and outside bodies across all kinds of borders, and as it changed from solid to liquid to gas. And I remain interested in its continual movement and cycling, its immense relationship with all forms of life on the planet." And then toward the end of the chapter, she says, Nebe, like all Nishnaabe theories, is an emergent theory of internationalism. Nebe's practices on a small scale are replicated on a larger scale. Nebe works with and asks us to embrace uncertainty, multiplicity, adaptation, iteration, and decentralization as forces that create the conditions for life to emerge and continue. Nebe is inside us, and it connects us to all forms of life on the planet. Nebe matters. And I think all of this really shakes up the settler ways of thinking about ourselves as separate from the world or as separate from nature or as more advanced beings that's sort of beyond the natural world around us.
Right.
And beyond and disconnected from the land and the water, and even thinking that we're separate from one another and isolated from what's happening across the globe. And I think this theory of water, of Nebe, pushes us to reconsider all of that. And I think that's a big theme for me throughout the book.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. This was such a beautiful book and so moving and so profound. And I'm so glad we got to read it. I can't overstate how much I appreciated about this book and learning from this book and just the incredible wisdom that she offers to us in this book. And I appreciated her personal stories that she shares throughout this book. And so, I've really been looking forward to this conversation. For me, I agree with what you take away from this book as sort of a central theme. One of the biggest takeaways of the book for me was her offering an analysis of that theory of water or Nebe. So I'm going to take it back to chapter 2. She says, quote, "The present moment, one of climate catastrophe, of ongoing genocide and Nakba in Gaza, Palestine, of genocides in Sudan and Congo, demands that we direct our dreams and actions towards making worlds that refuse capitalism and dispossession and the spectacular violences required to maintain them. The present moment demands that we figure out how to create and maintain robust constellations of co-resistance and provide material support for anti-colonial movements locally and globally. As the access of capital and the states protecting that capital descend into fascism, the present moment demands that we come together and face our linked crises in a manner that ensures the sanctity of the planet for all species and generations yet to come." Beautiful in and of itself. But just a few lines later, she offers this theory of Nishnaabeg, and again, that's water, as a practice we should all employ in our response to the challenges we face right now. So she says, quote, Nishnaabeg asks us to ground ourselves intimately in land and place and relate that grounding to other movements, geographies, cultures, and lands. The shorelines of our lands, shaped by water, teach us about fractals, patterns repeated across scales, and show Nishnaabeg that the same practices we engage in within our family are practices we engage in as nations and in larger universe. Nishnaabeg teaches us that our thinking is most powerful when it can connect the intimate to the global and move between scales effortlessly. Nishnaabeg, water, is iterative, resilient, and transformative as it carves out spaces from rock over thousands of years. And water, Nishnaabeg, is interdependent and decentralized, a vessel for multitudes of land and water-based species and communities. And finally, water and Nishnaabeg always create more possibilities. Mm-hmm. And I just loved that so much. For me, it set the tone for what was to come in this book, but also about what's possible. You know, she offers this theory of Nishnaabeg as an emergent theory of internationalism, as you talk about, and that can be used on a small scale in our interpersonal relationships, in our local spheres of influence, but that it can also be replicated on the larger scale to create the conditions for life that we all need and we all deserve, which I thought is just such powerful stuff.
And one of the things that Leanne is pointing out in those sections you just pulled from is how connected we are to one another.
Yes.
It's a huge portion of that lesson, I think, or the wisdom that I take away. And then she goes on in chapter 14, which is called All of Them Carrying Yesterday, and makes a really powerful point about the ways that settler colonialism has been extractive. So Leanne says, quote, for centuries, indigenous peoples have built societies in formations that are anti-state, with a social contract that isn't a contract at all, but an ecology of caretaking. Nation states were built on top of us, using our bodies, minds, spirits, and land as resources and materials, or as threats to state sovereignty that were targeted for elimination. Our relationality was considered extractable and disposable. At the same time, since the arrival of the white man, we have also engaged in anarchistic resistances without necessarily laying claim to anarchism as a politics. Wow. And I think the point at the end is an interesting one because you see the related ways that true anarchist politics of relating to one another and taking care of one another is grounded in the same kind of concept of what Leanne describes as an ecology of caretaking.
Yeah.
You also see the anti-state nature of existing outside of the state,
right,
and before the state even. And so I think you see these ways that the wisdom of anarchist politics and Nishnaabeg emerging differently, but side by side and related in their core functions and values of a non-hierarchical, care-based culture and a way of organizing society beyond those ideas and in relationship, and that people have roles to play, but it's not that the roles automatically imbue you with some kind of power to govern or rule or dictate what somebody else should be doing. And I think that there's some beauty in seeing the parallels there and acknowledging the differences, and that there's wisdom that comes before the concepts of what anarchist politics looks like. And there's a way that I think we look at what life looked like prior to enclosure of the commons and sort of the colonization of Europe from inside of Europe.
Right.
And where does anarchism come from in thinking about the sort of European version of what anarchism is, and is it related in a similar way to the indigenous people who were then colonized by European kingdoms and forces, and what's that parallel there? And that's a whole lot of stuff that I just said.
You sure did.
I don't know what the history is there and where it comes from and where those practices come from necessarily. They feel related, and she's naming that they feel related too, even if we're not using the same language to label things.
Yeah, absolutely. That's some great analysis you just did of all of that. The part that kind of stuck out to me, I mean, all of that did, but this idea that, nation states were built on top of us and control us and control the land and Nishnaabeg, control everything. And so really thinking about the response to that and thinking about how much that still is at play today and how much, the state is trying to control all of us. And so how do we respond to that? How do we push back against that? How do we find ourselves and work together in community with one another to go against that? That part to me was just kind of beautiful there in that chapter.
Yep.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we're jumping all around here. You were just in chapter 14, right? I'm going all the way back to chapter 4. That chapter was called Centering. And I loved that chapter. I loved the imagery in that chapter. I felt a lot of hope and a vision for the possibility of a better world when I was reading this chapter. So I don't know what, chapter 4 just really got me. So here's part of what Leanne says about the concept of centering. Quote, centering is a joining. It is a communal transformation that creates a fabric of former snowflakes bonded to each other. It is a process of changing from a singular, angular snowflake to a more rounded form of bonded crystals or snowpack, a denser, more compact, linked formation. As the snow centers, it settles and becomes denser, stronger, and soggier under the influence of gravity. Centering is slow deformation. And then a few lines later, she says, quote, many factors influence centering: temperature, humidity, time of day, weather, who is using the trail, and how. But I think of none of those each morning when I'm on the sled. I think only of this idea, that the first thing a snowflake does when it lands from the sky world is to join bonds, actual physical bonds, with its neighbors. It weaves itself into its environment, and it does so in a way that doesn't destroy its neighbors. Centering is bonding. It is building coalitions with your neighbors. And these coalitions mean that the packed center snow on the trail has staying power, that it remains long after spring has melted the snow around it.
Yeah.
Right? Like, beautiful. And the way that water in the form of centered snow has taught Leanne and Indigenous folks about the beauty and the power of bonds and coalitions and being in community with one another and relying on our neighbors and caring for our neighbors and how centering creates possibilities was just a huge takeaway for me. And I just sat with chapter 4 for a while. And it was just another example of how these Indigenous practices and ways of thinking are powerful in terms of how we can and should think about resistance.
Yeah, and it's something too that I think it flips what we consider to be common sense on its head.
Oh yeah,
in a lot of ways too, where it's something coming to a new place and joining it in a way that makes sense and makes it stronger.
And naturally, it just happens.
And that's the process.
Yes.
Versus other ways and the ways that we separate ourselves constantly in, so-called Western culture. So I think that was beautiful. It's a concept that I think that's one of the ones that I will think about for a long time. It will just pop up in my head when I'm thinking about something else or thinking about something that's related or feels related or like it's a powerful story or metaphor to use to illustrate a concept of bringing people together.
Absolutely.
So it feels much more in touch with how we join in and participate in communities or how it should happen.
Yes,
I guess,
absolutely.
It's really how it should happen.
Yep.
Is the emphasis there. It also makes me think of this section in chapter 18, which is called Recapturing, that is basically the opposite way to interact or to relate.
Oh, yeah.
She makes this point that illustrates the settler mentality that separates us from one another, that the way of doing things does not allow for centering or building true coalitions. She says, quote, indigenous understandings of the world are processed, depoliticized, sanitized, and colonized into a form that is nearly unrecognizable to the knowledge holders who shared it in the first place. The state and its educational institutions and research funding agencies is interested in extracting, translating, decoding, integrating, separating, dispossessing, textualizing, documenting, and sorting the knowledge of indigenous peoples into a format that can be used to bolster the state's agenda, give the impression of collaboration, and disrupt indigenous resistance, and ultimately open up our bodies of collective understanding to freedom of information requests. And we've seen this happen where the academy borrows or wants to partner with indigenous communities or other marginalized communities, but that partnership is not reciprocal. It's extractive. It's tell me your stories, tell me what you know, so I can use it for my research or for whatever it is. And she just illustrates that exploitative nature of the state and how that happens in a variety of ways, including the academy. And she's pointing out that not only is the state extracting this knowledge, but it's sanitizing the knowledge to further the state's agenda, just decoupling it from the relational, interdependent nature of this way of life, which is the opposite of centering.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
This version is a snowflake arriving, picking up all the other snowflakes and taking it with it and leaving behind nothing.
Yeah. Absolutely, just the field or wherever it is. Yeah, I appreciated this chapter as well, and this idea of, and I love that she calls that out and names it as something that is happening and something that is really something that needs to be addressed and known. So I love that. One of the other chapters that stood out to me, I don't know how we're just picking these chapters. There's so much brilliance in this book.
There's 23 chapters.
23 chapters, and we're going to talk about 5 of them. I really enjoyed chapter 13. It was called Maps to Statelessness. And for me, there was a bit of vulnerability that Leanne shares in this chapter that I think a lot of us can relate to. So she says, quote, "There are moments where I'm overwhelmed and I feel as though I'm drowning in problems with no solutions and never-ending work tasks and in feelings of helplessness as I watch Israel destroy every living being in Gaza. Feeling overwhelmed is a kind of existential flood. But as Stephen Salaita writes, feeling helpless doesn't mean being useless. I'm also thinking about Nishnaabeg and the decision they made to flood the earth after Jizi Gokwe and Jize Manadu's attempt at world making have failed. I think about how when you travel the land with elders and stop to set up camp, there is always shockingly little dialogue as each person does what needs to be done to make a home. Someone immediately starts gathering firewood to make a fire to boil tea. Someone else surveys the spot and determines the best place to set up tents or make the fire. Other people unload the canoe or the boat. They are embodying the same ethics as Nishnaabeg. They see a job that needs to be done, and they do it." And so for me, again, I appreciated her vulnerability in sharing that with us, these feelings of overwhelm and what to do in that moment. And she does that in multiple places throughout the book, I should say. But I very much so appreciated this concept that I think we've talked about several times here on the pod before. There's a space for all of us, and there's work for all of us in this fight. And it's going to take all of us working together and resisting together to create the world that we need. And so, I think I've said this before, like get in where you fit in, where you see where there are issues. We all have the capacity to do something in this work and in the fight. So let's do that. And she names that really brilliantly here.
Yeah, and it makes me think about when you show up to a campsite, if you're a beginner,
Yeah.
what do you do? And if you don't know, right, like in this example, she's talking about showing up with elders.
Yeah.
And the elders don't talk about a plan. They just go out and start
do
doing
it.
stuff.
Yeah.
It's like, all right, well, we need these 10 things to be done in the next hour or whatever the time frame is. Or
Right.
it's maybe not even a time frame. But if you don't know what those things are, when you enter that frame of mind, you enter that campsite, metaphorically speaking, what then do you do? And hopefully one of those elders is around to be like, hey, help me gather firewood or help me do this. And then
help me unload the boat.
You go as you learn. And so
Absolutely.
but there's also a point of choosing to enter the campsite and then also pausing and looking around and be like, all right, what's the work that's already happening and what can I do to fit in?
Absolutely. Very good.
All right, well, let's talk about application because we started.
Okay.
How can we apply this wonderful book to our day-to-day lives and work? My application comes from chapter 23, the last chapter, which is called A Theory of Water.
That's fitting.
It is. Leanne is outlining some of the key concepts of the theory of water to close out the book. So she says, quote, politics that are fractal, adaptive, nonlinear, and iterative, resilient and transformative, interdependent and decentralized, all move towards more possibilities for life. Human worlds that are fractal, adaptive, nonlinear, iterative, resilient, and transformative, interdependent, and decentralized all move towards more possibilities for life. Solidarities that are fractal, adaptive, nonlinear, and iterative, resilient, and transformative, interdependent, and decentralized all move towards more possibilities for life. An indigenous internationalism, which is at once hyper-local and global, encompasses all life on the planet. It is a presence and a presencing. It connects all living things. It cycles and reproduces the planet. Nishnaabeg's theories are all around us all the time. the most magnificent manifestation of me no beam a dizawin. It is a theory of water, and it lives inside all of us. And me no beam a dizawin means the good life, which is probably an oversimplification, but it illustrates the point.
Yes.
It's not like Kanye West good life. It's much broader than that.
Yes.
It's grounded a lot more in sort of interdependent relations of all the things that were just said in that passage. And so we can have politics and human worlds and solid areas that move us toward more possibilities for life rather than fewer possibilities. We can live in connection, and we can think about how Nishnaabeg connects all of us in so many different ways.
Yes.
And what does that connection mean? That the water that is in me right now has been in the ocean or in a tree.
Yes.
Or feeding other root systems. It's a constant cycle.
Absolutely.
And it's one of the things that when I say this is a beautiful book, like rethinking what our connection is to water and then thinking about how land is connected to water and vice versa. It's all a living system that we're all connected in. And I think reimagining how we're connected to it undoes the constant learning and messaging we've had as settlers, as people in the United States in a settler colony, the learning that we've had that we're separate from those things or that we're somehow hierarchically above them.
Yeah.
And this theory of water, I think, changes so much of that when you take it in.
Yeah. Brings us back to what's important and what's right, ultimately, I think. And I love that we do live in connection. We are connected beings. We are connected to water. Yeah, such beauty. My application comes from part of Leanne's great analysis and processing of the wisdom of her elders way back in chapter 5. And so she says this, quote, "Some of our origin stories have elaborate explanations for the creation of the world, and sometimes creation is spontaneous and instant. This time, in Doug's story, the world was created instantly, and everything was beautiful. But as Doug told us, this peace didn't last. One day, things started to go very wrong. Everything died off, and no one knew why. Doug said it could be that life is actually not that easy to keep. It could be that life is not that easy to keep. As I write it down, this sentence sticks out in a way it did not when I heard Doug tell the story orally. It sticks out because it is an old Nishnaabeg way of ethically suggesting what happened when one wasn't there as a witness. I feel a wave of humility when I read it out loud, and also gratitude. I am reminded that my ancestors did not take life for granted, and the process of keeping each other alive, or keeping oneself alive, was understood from the beginning to be dependent upon a profound care for each other and all life. It could be that life is fragile. It could be that it took a lot of research and difficult labor to make a sustaining global ecosystem that supported a cacophony of life. It could be that in making life, we don't always get it right. It could be that when everything is created instantly and perfectly, it doesn't last. It could be that life needs continual remaking to renew itself. It could be that in isolation, no individual or community has the knowledge we need to build worlds. It could be that we need to make the knowledge intercommunally. It could be that world making is struggle. I mean, come on. And I love here that our applications are related. But for me, that was really profound, a hard moment of me highlighting like crazy. You know, a little bit later on in that chapter, she talks about how all of that resonates for her as she, and I think honestly, all of us sit on the edge of climate collapse and never-ending world endings, I think was the term she used. And I just felt that in my soul, especially as we live in a world where we're getting bombarded with push notifications about the 27 things that have just gone completely batshit crazy in a single day. But for me, this passage was a great reminder and application that world making is a struggle. And it doesn't mean that it's not worth doing, but we certainly have to fight for it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's not another choice.
Absolutely.
All right, well, let's talk about homework.
Okay.
What are we going to do to continue our learning and unlearning work beyond our conversation today? Leanne references several books and thinkers in this book that I'd love to revisit just because I think revisiting stuff helps you find new things,
Yes.
new points of reference in the books. Also, because I've read this, something like this, I think, reorients my thinking. And so I'll read Emergent Strategy or Elite Capture or any of the other things that
Solidarity.
she names
Yeah.
in here with a different lens.
Yeah.
And that'll give me a different learnings from it.
Absolutely.
And so that's kind of what I was thinking for homework is how do I find time to go back and dig into some of these books that we've read and loved and talked about on the podcast before with different eyes, just from learning from Leanne about the theory of water.
Absolutely. I love that. I think my application is somewhat similar. I just want to revisit this book, the chapters in it, all of the incredible wisdom that Leanne presents in it, because there's literally so much of it. And so I want to sit with it more. And I love your then further application of that to connect it to the books we've read and to see how this shapes the additional learning that could come.
Yeah.
I also would love to check out some of Leanne's other books. You know, she wrote Rehearsals for Living with Robin Maynard, which we talked about, I think, last year on the podcast. But some of her other recent-ish books include As We Have Always Done, Indigenous Freedom Through Radical Resistance, and A Short History of the Blockade. And so I'd love to maybe check those out eventually in our, long list of books.
Yes. All right. Well, that's it for our conversation today about a theory of water. And Damien, you're up next time. What do you bring to the table in our next episode?
Yeah, so I'm going to bring a piece from In These Times to the table for us to talk about in our next episode. The piece is called Democratic Leadership Still Hasn't Caught Up to the Party's Base on Gaza. It was written by Stephen Zunes, and it was published last month. And the tagline of the article is, quote, amid growing calls for an end to U.S. support of Israel among Democrats, the consensus is starting to shift, even if the establishment tries to stand in the way. And, it's reminded me of our conversation last week, a couple weeks ago, with Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor's piece about the Democratic Party's ineffective leadership in response to and standing up against Trump. And so I thought this article might allow us to focus a bit more on that part of the conversation, using the context of the ongoing genocide taking place in Gaza, which I just can't believe I'm saying those words, the ongoing genocide. So, yeah, I'm excited to read the piece and chat with you about it next time.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see very little shift in Democratic leadership.
Very little.
Despite the UN now saying officially that it is a genocide, despite New York Times reports about what the IDF is doing systematically in a ground offensive, quote unquote, in Gaza, like just so little shift in
movement
and recognizing what's actually happening and what the choices that they're making are actually supporting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is why the rest of us, the party's base, quote unquote, so to speak, even though I don't always consider myself part of that base, they haven't caught up.
Yeah, that's where the disconnect is.
So disconnected.
Absolutely. So,
all right. Cool. Well, let's talk about that next week.
All right.
That sounds like a plan. So with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. We'll talk to you next week.